Hi, I am Madeline James, and today we are going to be talking about currency, which is going to be a sort of side world building guide part of my series. It's sort of out of line, but still fitting in line with the cultural societal one. Yes, this is a topic that was voted on by my patrons, although we aren't going to do these kinds of voted videos anymore. But yes, we are talking today about currency and what came before. And so, one quick warning is you will notice my background is a bit strange. Just ignore it. It'll be like this for a couple of months. I got a sit-stand desk that I've been using, but obviously my old desk is there, so my old background is over there. And I'm going to be moving rooms, so I'm not shuffling it all around right now, so just put up with it. But anyway, currency, let's get going. Alright, so before we talk about currency and the types of currency and stages of economies around it, we should talk about what came before currency. And I mean, it wasn't like one day there was suddenly state-backed, mass-produced, and widely trusted metal coins. There were transition periods, stages, and different speeds with which different circles grew closer to what we think of when we say currency. And understanding what came before can help us understand what came after. So, what did come before? I bet most of you are thinking, barter. And you would be wrong. This is actually just a myth. If you want to know a lot more, you can look up the myth of barter economies. There's a lot out there that will do a better job of explaining it than I can. But think about it, right? If you're taking your pigs to market and you need to buy some bread, what if the baker doesn't want pork, right? It's not really a good system. Not to say that barter never occurred here or there, but it certainly wasn't the basis for entire economies. So what actually came before currency? Gifts. This may surprise you, might be hard to understand how civilizations function like this given our modern day sensibilities, but gift economies were around and still are for far longer than market economies. And this was how early human society functioned because it is rooted in how human society works. Until you throw in inequality and subjugation and all that. Check out my antiquity guide if you're curious here. But human societies are based on equality, reciprocity, and community. Even in societies with some stratification and elites, wealth was commonly seen as a thing to give, not a thing to hoard. Prestige came with giving. And this isn't as alien as you might think. If you run out of sugar and you're in the middle of making cookies, you might ask your neighbor, hey, can I borrow some sugar? And this isn't expected to be paid back right away, 1-to-1, right? Your neighbor helps, and one day, if you can, you help them. So say they twist their ankle and need to shovel their driveway. If you're able, you help. This is, in a lot of ways, the entire basis of community. So it's important for us to understand this because it's likely that there are places where gift economies are still the norm, like they are today in some indigenous communities, among friends, and maybe even in your neighborhood. There is this view of reciprocity according to social distance that can be helpful for us to keep in mind. So the closer the social bond, the more we will see gift-giving forms of reciprocity or positive reciprocity. The further the social distance, the more we see the opposite, negative reciprocity, aka plunder and theft. So what happens when we want to exchange goods outside our close communities and kin groups? We're not necessarily inclined towards gift giving, right? These are strangers, they aren't people you can expect to help you out in the future. So as societies grew, people's networks grew, and states began to consolidate power, and we can move a little closer to currency. So as trade expands past the boundaries of the community, people start to trade in commodities. These are things of tangible value, think grain and livestock. Now, like I mentioned before, most communities, villages, and such places would still work with a gift economy, but beyond that, we have trade. A commodity economy is one where trade is based on commodities as the medium of exchange. A commodity is something that is widely valued and used, interchangeable, typically a raw or basic good that is needed for production of some form. So these can be anything from agricultural products to metals. Now, at first, this would be smaller scale, but eventually, as trade networks grew, so would these commodity economies. Societies that lack some essential goods have a strong impetus for developing trade, such as is the case with Sumer. Sumer is perhaps the first example of a commodity economy. The first example of a commodity economy, say that 5 times fast. 5 times fast. Commodity, economy. Anyway, developing sometime between 4,500 and 4,000 BCE. And while the ability to trade in commodities opens economies up, it can only go so far. So trade of commodities like livestock and grain can have drawbacks, right? Trading cattle is a bit difficult, transportation-wise, and trading goods that change in value seasonally can be tricky. As trade continues to grow, we need something more efficient and more reliable, and here enters proto money. So proto money are objects used in ancient and early societies as part of the exchange of goods that were not necessarily standardized. These items were commonly commodities that had valued themselves as trade goods. There were some forms of proto money that were likely exclusively used for trade, though. So what makes a good proto money? It must be widely accepted and widely valued, should be small and easy to exchange, should be durable enough to not require special handling or storage, not be too commonplace and easy to acquire, be difficult to counterfeit, and be relatively uniform or standardized. So obsidian or volcanic glass, not pictured here, I couldn't find a good picture of this, was highly valued in some early societies for its ability to make sharp tools and weapons. In the Mediterranean and Near East, in Mesoamerica, among other places, obsidian was a valuable commodity used as a proto-money beginning as early as 12,000 BCE. It was eventually replaced by more standardized alternatives. Other examples of commodities used as proto-money include salt, oil, grains, cattle, and cacao beans. Cowrie shells are perhaps the most successful examples of proto-money, having the longest history of any other currency. These were used across African, East Asian, and South Asian trade networks and likely further. While they were first used around 2000 BCE, they were still used in some places up to 1960 CE, an almost 4,000-year history. Cowrie shells were such a great commodity because they were small, durable, and hard to counterfeit. They were also very consistently sized and could be counted by weight. These shells were a commodity as they were used in jewelry, ornamentation, and have cultural significance. And even once some economies moved past cowrie shells, the legacy did not go away. One of the coins in Ghana has a cowrie shell on it, and the unit of currency is their word for the shell. So the first forms of currency in China were bronze cowrie shells. This sort of thing can be a great way to show an item that has a lot of cultural and historical significance in your society. Of course, the use of precious metals for coins started with proto monies as well. So think about the unshaped bits of bronze called a cerud of Rome. Now, as societies centralize, we start seeing more regulations and laws. Sumer was especially known for this, many of these laws being established around 2100 BCE. And these laws covered things like debt and interest, property ownership and inheritance, and commercial transactions. This then provided the foundation for other laws like Babylon's Code of Hammurabi in 1758 BCE. So one quote about this code from history.com, which I think well shows how it established prices in a way that also enforced social stratification. A doctor's fee for curing a severe wound would be 10 silver shekels for a gentleman, 5 shekels for a freedman, and 2 shekels for a slave. It is worth noting that a shekel is a unit of weight in silver, specifically around 0.4 ounces at the time it eventually became a coin. To my understanding. Again, there's a lot of research and stuff in this that I've only touched the surface of, but it is worth noting that this code wasn't very effective at controlling prices and rates. They've become more effective over time in various places, but it does highlight something important. With larger trade networks and larger, more centralized societies, standardizing the comparative value of things is important even before we have general purpose currency. Alright, so let's talk about a unit of account. This serves as a measurement of the value of things, but doesn't actually act as a universal currency. So payments could be made by a common standard unit, commonly of copper, silver, or grain, to determine the value of something. Let's say you want to buy some cloth, which is X copper per pound. Perhaps you have oil instead to purchase it with. Well, if you know how many copper per pound that oil is worth, you can make a fair trade. Frequently, you wouldn't purchase the cloth using copper but another commodity, such as oil, clothing, or fat, whose value would be regulated. So in these cases, the money or unit of account is used to measure the value of goods, but not actually used for payment in most cases. So for example, under the dynasty of Hammurabi and Babylonia, so 1792-1750 BCE, while prices were expressed in silver, most payments were made in barley or corn. And while it wasn't always this neat and tidy, this is a step towards the abstraction of currency or money. Another thing we tend to see before universal general purpose currency is special purpose monies. These come into play when there are different spheres of exchange that allow the use of different monies. These were tied to specific social relationships, helped reinforce social hierarchies, and often had symbolic purpose over intrinsic material value. So one example is the Yap stone money, pictured here. These large stone discs, known as Rai, R-A-I, with a hole in the middle for transporting with like wooden poles that could be like rolled or carried. They were mined and crafted from an island 400 kilometers away on expedition via canoes and then transported back, like carrying these things via rafts and stuff. Like it was a process to go mine this stone for these discs. And the larger ones, like the one pictured here, they can even be significantly taller than people, were extremely valuable and were thought to be used for rewards, for extinguished guests, and other very large purposes, for maybe like replacing a whole roof or a whole house or stuff like that, right? And they had some smaller ones that they used as smaller denominations, but they're huge, and they're typically so big, you can see them like laying around if you look these up in pictures of villages and stuff. And when one of these would be gifted or given or exchanged or something like that, they typically wouldn't even move the disc. They would just like put a little marker on it being like, this belongs to so-and-so now, but they were so heavy that it wasn't worth moving them, which I think is just very cool. So perhaps within communities you have your gift economies. Your general trade beyond that is based off basic commodities, maybe with a unit of account. And then there are a few unique spheres of exchange with their own money. Perhaps there's a specific way to pay for a bride price, such as brass rods for the Tiv people of Nigeria. Perhaps only luxury or very expensive purchases are made using a form of money only allowed by the elites of your society. This can be a very interesting way to share about your society's social structure. And while special purpose monies are typically replaced once general purpose currency enters the scene, some of these items can remain in symbolic or ceremonial use. And now we can move on to what you probably thought we were going to start with, coins. The first coins would be pretty rudimentary and basic, likely used based off weight as a commodity. But at some point, trade starts to get bogged down by the need to weigh and test the purity of various metal coins. And so we see a desire for something guaranteed by the state to have an exact value and quality. So we need something sufficiently valuable at small sizes, something durable, something that can be clearly marked and difficult to counterfeit. Enter state-minted metal coins. These were used for all purposes, a medium of exchange, a unit of account, and an actual store of the value they represented. So early metal currencies would have to be weighted and tested to ensure appropriate purity of value before they could be traded, but new coins, backed by the government, and with the official seal, could be trusted and taken as is. So trade would be faster, more reliable, and overall more efficient. These coins are physically valued at their trade value. They back themselves to an extent. So in the 7th to 6th century BCE, King Aliatus of Lydia, currently Turkey, as always, who knows with my pronunciation, created the first official coins, which were made of electrum, which is a silver and gold mix, and marked these with the official government seal, a lion. These were used for large purchases, as they had a higher value than many coins that would come later. So eventually we had a 1/24 stater electrum coin was worth about the same as a sheep or a bushel of grain, for example. So you couldn't just buy some eggs or a loaf of bread with these. Roman coins are also a good example to look at, looking at around 300 BCE to 300 CE, as they were tiered and more developed with a bronze, silver, and gold coin. So a silver coin, a denarius, was the daily wage of a soldier or skilled worker, probably the major coin. One of these coins could buy you a modest dinner at a tavern. A bronze coin, a sestertius, was worth a quarter of a denarius and could typically buy a loaf of bread. The main gold coin, an arius, was worth 25 times the denarius. It was only used by the wealthy for significant purchases. There were smaller value coins as well, such as the dupondius, which is bronze/brass, the as, a bronze coin, and the semis, which is also a bronze coin. And you can see some of these cool pictures here of these. Pronunciation, who knows? Now, something I hope you're picking up on is that these coins tended to be valued based off common governmental expenses, so like paying for their soldiers or basic purchases like loaves of bread or grain. And also that most coins in circulation would be bronze or iron or other cheaper metals. Silver and gold could be rare and used more by the wealthy. So let's talk about some of the aspects of a state-minted coin that you might need to think about. So the first is material. Bronze, iron, and other cheaper metals are going to be used by the majority of the population for cheaper purposes. Coins like copper and silver will be a bit higher value, and gold coins being extremely rare. Blends of metals in the form of alloys were also common, and of course this would depend on what materials they had available. So looking at China, for example, the wide use of silver coins didn't even begin there until the 16th to 17th century. So, shape. Round coins were the most common, but there were certainly exceptions. For example, in China, some coins, such as the earliest copper coin, the Banliang Chong, BANLIANGQIAN, yes, which was 221 to 206 BCE, was round with a square hole in the center. This is due to the belief that heaven is round and the earth is square. They were also able to be tied together on strings, but they also had spade-shaped coins, knife-shaped coins, and ring-shaped coins in different periods. So how were these coins marked? You could see portraits of rulers, like in Roman and Byzantine coins, scripture or calligraphy, like some Ottoman coins, religious and political symbols, like Byzantine coins, and even special commemorative coins. Now, amounts. It seems pretty common to me to have a coin that is a standard measure that they historically used, perhaps a head of smaller livestock like a sheep or a bushel of grain, and then to have coins that were fractions of this amount. It also seems fairly common to have a coin representing the daily wage of a soldier or skilled worker. Think of who the government is paying with these coins, and then to have some much higher value coins that are restricted to the wealthy. And now, as usual, I don't worry about things that are more on the modern end, but there is one more type of currency we can talk about in the kind of time periods I cover. Paper money. Now, paper money first cropped up as a way to formalize IOUs and promissory notes in the Tang Dynasty of ancient China around the 9th century. These didn't become official government-issued currency until the Song Dynasty, 960 to 1279, about. This area was ahead in printing innovations compared to many other parts of the world and had a long-standing tradition of producing paper. So other places in Europe didn't really produce paper currency until centuries later. Around 1661 is the best date I can find. Paper currency is an innovation that allows for easier storage and lighter transportation and also allows governments to not reserve large amounts of metal for coin production. It is certainly an option to consider. So, the steps for this are a little bit more vague than my guides usually have. But our first step is going to be to think about what spheres of society operate under positive, neutral, and negative reciprocity, right? The second step is going to be to determine what the major commodities of the trade region were or are. This can help determine some standard units of measure used for trading or what the actual commodity might be if we're in a commodity economy. 3, determine what the separate spheres of exchange there are or were, and what special purpose monies were used and how they might stick around symbolically if you've already moved over to a more general purpose currency. And then 4, determine if there will be state-backed currency and consider what materials, values, shapes, and seals these coins might have. As an example, we're going to look through our setting scenarios that we use for the main Cultural Societal World Building Guide series. And the big thing to note here, right, is that we haven't gotten that far with the cultural and societal world building for these. So my notes are going to be kind of vague, but I hope they give you a rough idea to get started with, but they aren't going to get too nitty-gritty because we haven't fleshed them out that much. So our first setting is Cyberpunk 1477. If you haven't, there's videos on these earlier in the guide if you want to watch them. But I wrote down some of the things that I think might be valuable commodities or valuable trade exports. And for here we have diamonds, jade, gold, and grain. This region sort of began as a series of settler colonies established due to the gem and gold mines, and also just general population expansion. So it seems reasonable to have some prices based off percentages of gold weight values or gem values. Maybe a bushel of grains, etc. would also be significant. So then for spheres of exchange, I think within the outskirt communities far from the center, because you'd have this big imperial center and then this huge amount of expansion of people that the further away they are, they kind of have less connection to the main center. But I think you'll see gift-based communities anywhere out in the like Midlands or the outskirts for sure. So then the currency itself, I'm picturing state minted coins, so each guild having their own seal and backed coinage with maybe the same value, maybe like different comparative values based off which guilds are doing better at the time, I'm not sure. Gold would be higher value coins. They would also probably have silver coins. These would all mainly be used internally. And the elite might trade with like diamonds, right? Which is the main export that provides wealth there. And also, we haven't figured out what the magic system is yet, but there's some sort of magitech. So I'm saying there's magic rocks that do different things and are used for magic tech by the guilds. And these can be traded and mined by the guilds, but individuals outside of the elite within the guilds aren't allowed to own or trade with them. So they'd probably be used for various important, things, or exchanged as like, I don't know, things. It's unclear. So then for the setting, the demon made me do it. Some of these major trade commodities would be iron, zinc and lead, pigs and water buffalo, and then wood. And then for their spheres of exchange, I've kind of established like 4. You'd have the villages themselves, which would be our gift economies. Getting into the markets, which would probably have a commodity economy, probably with a very well regulated and established unit of account. And then with the government, they're going to have labor, where the government will provide people with services in exchange for required labor. And then the elites are probably going to trade with gems carried over from previous location, which they kind of migrated down, for symbolic things, right? These gems aren't being mined or acquired anymore, or maybe they do try to trade for them sometimes, but that area has kind of collapsed and isn't really great. Yes. So then for the currency, again, you're mainly having a corvée-based labor reciprocity with the government, right? They're requiring time. So instead of them having a specific coinage thing they set up, they will instead just have a highly regulated, monitored, commodity-based currency vibe, right? So gems and the elite still trade with those for high-profile symbolic purchases. And then they have a register for how much things are worth based off gems. And the main economies with grains, cocoa, vanilla, etc. All right, so then whose city is it anyway? With this one, we have sapphires, ironfish, and crops as commodities. And we sort of have more groups here, so I've kind of been a little bit more vague. But we have our indigenous villages, which don't really exist anymore. These populations are sort of interspersed, but I think they would hold on to that by still having a sort of gift economy. And then I think that we would have a leftover of the proto money that they would have sort of used sort of as a commodity, which would be these like obsidian discs that they would still use between groups that might be still kind of prevalent a little bit. And then the people that conquered them, right, there's the people that settled the area, whatever, they're going to have a proto money of iron blades and then some commodity monies, and then we'll have an external empire, which will have a state-backed currency, which is then has been interacting with the region, so like some of that would be prevalent as well. And I like the idea of having the obsidian as a proto money for the indigenous people, because it would have a religious, spiritual, cultural significance due to the association with the volcano. And for the conquerors, one of the special purpose like things for like either trading or other maybe ceremonial or like bride price type uses would be like sapphire statues, because that's a big thing there. And then the external empire would probably be willing to trade for the iron blades because they would, be inherently valuable. And then they would also trade with their state minted coins of various forms. So then last we have glaciers and alpacas, which this is going to be a much more centralized group, semi-nomadic of some form. They're going to have like alpaca wool, they're going to have meat from alpacas and also reindeer, antlers, milk and cheese, that sort of stuff, right? So obviously within all of their villages, we have gift economies, and then with other villages, we might start to get into some gift economy maybe for closer villages, but then also maybe getting into some commodities with grain, meat, antlers, etc. But then when they interact and trade with the empire, they might use their coins or use that as a unit of account for trading their antlers, wool, grain, milk, cheese, etc., right? Yeah, so these are some resources. This is not a super helpful list. Yep. And then in conclusion, so that's what I have to say about currency. Again, my examples weren't the best. It would have been nice if I could have had one of these fleshed out to like really properly figure out a system of currency, but like I would need at least a naming language to be able to name the coins. I would need to know like significant things in the culture and society to put on seals of the coins. Like I would need to have a better understanding of like so many things to do that for these. But I hope it gives you a good idea of how to get started. And I would consider looking into similar currencies for what you want to create from history, just so you can get an idea of like some of the options and some of the like depth and how interconnected it can be with like social classes and culture and history and all of that. It's very cool. But yeah, we aren't going to have any more of these patron voted videos for a while. Instead, I'm going to be focusing on making progress on the main guide series. So continuing with society and cultural world building, and then also starting regional world building guide, probably. Yeah, so I hope you enjoyed this, and I will see you in the next one.